Good morning, church. I wore a tie for you guys today. It took me 20 minutes to figure out how to put it on. Yeah, thanks. I discovered a website called tieatie.net and slowly but surely figured it out. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Rob Clark, and I have the privilege of serving with the youth and children's team at this church. It's a wonderful team. Aaron, I appreciated your call to worship this morning, and I promise I'll do my best not to put us to sleep this morning. We are in a series called Befriend right now, and we've been looking at how do we deepen our friendships, and how do we make room for new people outside of our circle to enter in. And every week, each message has had a title, and this week's message is Seek to Understand. Now, seeking to understand, when I first looked at it, my first thought was nobody ever looked at me and said, Rob, you are good at seeking to understand things. Especially junior high and high school. Growing up, seeking to understand was not really my gift, specifically with academics. I wasn't a very good student. I struggled understanding concepts and subjects. And I always tell people that the hardest Spanish 1 was the most difficult 3 years for me. And so was algebra and geometry and biology. But my wife's a biology teacher, so I'm starting to finally learn those things now. And there's a lot of factors that contributed to that. But mostly it came down to the fact that I didn't commit myself to seeking to understand these subjects. For example, when I was first in geometry, it took place during 5th period. The problem is lunch comes after 4th period, and I love my lunch. So I would take a little extra time to eat my In-N-Out burger. And the consequence of that is I often missed geometry class. I didn't get a very good grade because I didn't devote myself to understanding the subject. Because of that, I missed out on learning really a lot of helpful things that would have been nice to know later on in life. And I think the same thing is true for the church when we don't devote ourselves to understanding each other. When we don't devote ourselves to seeking to understand each other, we miss out on a lot of beautiful relationships that can take place, both within our inner circle and outside the inner circle. Now, if we were to do a brief theology of the church, and I've said this from the pulpit before, but I want to remind us because it sets a framework for today. If we were to do a brief theology of the church, we'd see that the church is often described by the scriptures as a family, with God as the Father and us as adopted children. Ephesians 1:4-5 says this, "For he chose us in him before the creation of the world to be holy and blameless in his sight. In love, he predestined us for adoption to sonship through Jesus Christ in accordance with his pleasure and will." We are siblings. And we have to see each other that way. Young and old, Republican and Democrat, wealthy or poor, we have to see each other as siblings. And as Philippians 2 says, as siblings, we have to put each other's interests above our own. This series, Befriend, goes hand in hand with the Befriend series on Right Now Media. And in this section, Seeking to Understand, we come across the story of a woman, a painful story of a woman who had just gone through a divorce. And she was in her faith community, and she came in feeling abandoned by God, feeling abandoned by her husband. And in her words, she said she felt devalued and she felt worthless. So she looked to the people of faith to give her encouragement. And what she got was a pat on the back. People shook her hand every Sunday. And people would say that they're praying for her. But she said, what I really needed was somebody to seek to understand me. I needed somebody to stand in the gap with me. I needed somebody to fight for me. And it was a painful process, and this story is not an uncommon one, especially for new people entering into a faith community. In my experience in ministry, a lot of times people come to a faith community for the first time is because of a pain or brokenness in their lives. And what they need is somebody to just initiate, to seek to understand their story. Jesus is an unbelievable example of what it looks like to have a heart to seek to understand someone's story. We're going to look at a gospel story this morning, and normally I know we put it on the screens or in the bulletin, But I asked Reed not to do that today because I sometimes reading takes away our imagination. So I'm going to read this gospel story, and I invite us as I do to imagine what's taking place here, to let it come to life the way that the church has done for thousands of years. It comes from Mark 5. It says this: When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so she'll be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. Little background, Jesus had crossed over by the Sea of Galilee. He had just come from the region of the Gerasenes where he had healed a man who had demons in him. So Jesus' power had been on display. They cross the Sea of Galilee, they get off the boat, and in comes Jairus. Now, Jairus wasn't just one of many synagogue leaders. He was the synagogue leader. He was a big shot. But when he sees Jesus, he believes in his power, and he falls on his knees in desperation because his kid is sick. His daughter's dying. I can imagine what kind of fear would be going through my mind as a dad. This story has taken on new meaning for me since I've had a child. But he falls on his knees in front of Jesus, and Jesus goes with Jairus to heal his daughter, but time is of the essence, right? Because his daughter's dying. Then a large crowd followed and pressed around him. A woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors, and she spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. So everybody knows that Jesus is going with Jairus, and everybody wants to see what's going to happen. So you have this crowd surrounding them, bumping into him. And in this crowd, we have this woman who, not like Jairus, is unknown. She had been suffering from menstrual bleeding for 12 years. Something in that culture and time, she would have been called unclean. An outcast. She was stripped of her name and her title and given the title of unclean. And she needed hope. So here's what happens. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and reached out to touch his cloak because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I'll be healed. Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she had been freed from suffering. I love that word, immediately. In desperation and in risk of being among this crowd, she reaches out and just touches the edge of Jesus' cloak. And immediately, she's healed. But now she's got to get out of there because it's dangerous for her to be in this group of people, to touch Jesus' cloak that way as an unclean person. So I imagine she's like, wow, I'm healed, and starts to run. But here's what happened. At once, Jesus realized power had gone out of him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched me?" The woman's like, uh-oh. The disciples ask him, "There are people crowding all around you. How can you ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened, came and fell at his feet, trembling. She gets caught. And it says that she told Jesus the whole truth. Falls at his feet and tells him the whole truth. And Jesus listens. Again, time is of the essence with Jairus' daughter, but Jesus stops to listen to her. And then Jesus does something surprising. After hearing her tell her whole story, he gives her a new name. Jesus says to her, daughter, your trust has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from suffering. He listens to her whole story and gives her a new name, daughter. Why? Because she's a sibling. She's part of this family, and as part of this family, she deserves to have her story heard and for her pain to be held. See, church is great at patting people on the back and shaking people's hands, but if the church wants to be unique, we have got to go a step beyond that. We have to seek to understand each other's stories, to stand in the gap with one another. Now, I want us to note what Jesus did and did not do in seeking to understand her story. James 1:19 reminds us to be slow to speak and quick to listen. Jesus didn't constantly interrupt her story by giving advice, by throwing scripture at her, although he was qualified to do that. He listened. And listening is one of the main keys in seeking to understand the other. Going back to me in high school, let's say I'm in biology class and my teacher's trying to explain to me the concept of diffusion and osmosis. I had to Google that. I don't know what it means still, but let's say they're trying to describe to me this concept of diffusion and osmosis, and I'm constantly raising my hand and interrupting my teacher, trying to give my own thoughts into the subject, of which I know nothing about. If I did that, I wouldn't really learn much about the subject, because what I'm doing is I'm thinking about what I want to say to the teacher instead of listening to what he's trying to describe to me. That's not good, because the teacher's the one who's the expert on the subject, not myself. And in the same way, the expert of someone's story and experience is that person themselves. And if we want to seek to understand that person, we have got to develop the discipline of listening. And I say this about the church because the responsibility of seeking to understand one another, the responsibility of caring for one another, is not just the responsibility of the pastors. Pastoral care is the job of the church theologically. We are called to care for one another, the church and the pastors together as siblings of God. We're called to seek to understand one another. Now, the challenges we face in seeking to understand are not just limited to the siblings that are new to us, but also especially the siblings that we've long recognized as brothers and sisters. I'm talking about our closest 2 to 3 friends, our core group. Now, when we look at spheres of friendships, typically the way it's laid out is the way that Jesus did it. He gave us an example. Jesus had several dozen people that followed him everywhere he went. It's like us, those people that we just call our general friends. Not that we have people following us everywhere. But we all have those people that we call friends, several dozen people. Jesus had that as well. But within that several dozen, he had a core group of 12. Those were his close friends, the ones a little bit more in his inner circle. But within that 12, Jesus had 3. His people, his boys, Peter, James, and John. And that's what I want to speak to, is those core 2 to 3 friends within our sphere that are our people. I want to talk about cultivating and deepening that relationship. Now, what I've learned in this series from talking to people is that the greatest frustration we have within our deep friendships is often the lack of depth and intimacy. So we gather fairly consistently, we hang out with one another, but when we hang out, we often find that the depth and intimacy that we so crave is not always there. We desire friendships like what was demonstrated in Job that Aaron read, where when we're in a place of struggle, that our friends we know will drop everything they're doing and come and sit in that gap with us. Job's friends tore their robes upon seeing the pain that their friend was experiencing, sprinkled dust on their head, and sat with him for 7 days. Man, that's the kind of friendship that we desire. It's a great demonstration of it. But the question is, how do we get there with our friends? How do we get to that level? Something that's been expressed to me by many in this church throughout this series is that we need to be really practical from on stage about how we develop this. Specific things. So practically, the way we get there, number 1, develop the discipline of listening. And number 2 is to learn how to ask good questions. When I shared this with my wife, Jessica, she said, okay, that's great, but I need you to give me specific questions that I can ask to go deeper with my friends. I don't know if we're thinking that way as well, but if we want to do that, look at Jesus first. He was the master of many things. One of them is asking great questions. From inquiring questions like, why are you so afraid in Matthew 8? To speaking truth through questions like, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I tell you? To asking questions about how he can serve, like, what do you want me to do for you? And finally, one of my favorite ones from John 5:6, do you want to be well? Jesus is the ultimate asker of good questions. So in an effort to be as practical as I can, I spent a good portion of my preparation for this Sunday thinking about and researching and asking folks, what are some good questions that we can ask to deepen our friendships? And I narrowed it down to 3 questions that we can ask. Now, these 3 can be varied a little bit to make them into more questions. But the first one to take a note from Jesus, is the question of, what do you want me to do for you? What do you want me to do for you? In other words, dig into how you can be more supportive. What are areas where I can be a better friend to you? That's a humbling question to ask that. And if you're going to ask that, be ready to do that for that person. Question 2, and this comes from Pastor Aaron. I like the way he says this. How are you doing, really? The phrase, how are you doing, is thrown around a lot, right? From Joey Tribbiani and friends, how you doing? To every time I go to Anthem Coffee, they say, Rob, how are you doing? And even if I'm completely miserable, what's my response? Good, yeah. But how are you doing, really? Opens the door for you to share honestly and vulnerably to that person. And the third question, this comes from Gottman, who we heard a lot in the marriage series. He invites us he encourages us to ask open-ended questions, starting with, how have you ... For example, he would say, how have you changed in the last year? How have you changed since you were a child? How have you been supporting your spouse lately? How have you been coping with your loss? Open-ended questions that encourage us to dig a little bit deeper in our answer, where we can't just get away with a one-word response. So these are good questions that we can ask to deepen our relationships. They're important questions to ask. But here's the key. They're important questions to ask once we're in a place with our people to be able to go there. Once we're in a place with our people to be able to go there. Because the reality is that just asking good questions does not deepen relationships. Good questions are just words. If we want depth and intimacy in our relationships, we have to first convince someone that we can hold their pain. That we won't just give an easy answer or throw a Bible verse at them. We have to create safety. We have to earn the right to ask these questions. I can't just come up with a question and expect a deep relationship to happen if I listen. Now, I had the chance to consult an expert on this as I was preparing, because something I quickly realized is that I spent 10 years in seminary getting my master's in divinity, and I learned a lot of things. I learned how to dissect Greek and do that. I learned how to take something from 2,000 years ago and try to make it relevant today. One thing I did not learn is the practicality of deepening our friendships. That's not something they train you in seminary. In fact, most seminarians are terrible at friendships. But the longer I'm in ministry, the more I realize how few things I'm an expert on. And I felt like consulting Google would be a disservice to all of us. So I reached out to somebody who's been a licensed marriage and family therapist for over 20 years. She's had her own practice in Gig Harbor for a very long time. And she's looking at opening up a new one in Orange County. And she's frankly the best person I've ever met at asking good questions. It's my mom. And my mom's mother's here today, and she knows that better than anybody. So I set up a phone date with my mother on Tuesday afternoon to ask her, how do we ask good questions? And she took me to school. She said this, here's the thing about asking good questions, Rob. You can't expect people to undress in front of you unless you undress in front of them. We cannot expect people to undress vulnerably in front of us unless we undress vulnerably in front of them. I said, Mom, I need to consult you more often. She went on to say that the reason many therapists have good questions that carry weight is because when we enter into therapy, we expect that out of the relationship. We expect them to ask these good, probing, hard, difficult questions. But friendships are different. To start with, and we've talked about this in this series, but it bears repeating, we have to create safety within our friendships. We have to earn the right to ask those questions, and part of earning that right is this vulnerability aspect. Once we are vulnerable with someone, then it begins to open a door for them to be vulnerable with us. And then she shared this phrase that I loved, hospitality of the heart. We have to create this environment of hospitality of the heart. Now, many of us, when we think of hospitality, we think about opening our homes to people. But hospitality of the heart is where we have this space where we create it to be welcoming and inviting to people. An environment of warmth. Think about those qualities that prompt you to feel safe with someone. Are they honest? Are they open with their struggle? Are they not quick to judge or too quick to give advice? Are they quick to hold your pain with you and stand in the gap with you? That is what hospitality of the heart is and what invites people to come forward. But all of these things, bottom line, comes from doing our own work. Because we can't hold someone else's pain unless we can embrace our own. We can't hold someone else's pain unless we can embrace our own. Are we willing to be on our face before the Lord and recognize and identify our own brokenness and go through the hard work of allowing Him to work that out within us? That's what it takes if we want to deepen our friendships. We must first seek to understand ourselves. And then we earn the right with people to seek to understand them by asking good questions, by cultivating a safe space, by being vulnerable with the ones that we desire to be vulnerable with us. But ultimately, to do that, it requires us to be able to connect with our own brokenness. I'm a huge fan of Henry Nouwen. If any author has changed my life, it's been Henry Nouwen. And he wrote a book called Wounded Healer that I read once a year. It's about ministering out of our wounds. And he says this in the book about hospitality. What does hospitality as a healing power require? It requires, first of all, that hosts feel at home in their own house. And second, that they create a free and fearless place for the unexpected visitor. Hospitality requires first that we feel at home in our own house, where we connect with the brokenness within us. And then out of that, we can connect with the brokenness of others by creating a free and fearless place for them to enter into. So if we want to have that friendship that we see in Job, where people stand in the gap with us, sit with us in our wounds, hold our pain dearly and safely, we need to create a hospitality of the heart, a place that's safe for pain and brokenness to be held. Number 2, we need to show that we're willing to go there ourselves. And 3 is, in that place, ask good questions. And as those questions are being answered, remember the way that Jesus interacted with that woman and listen, with a posture of being quick to listen and slow to speak. Let's pray. Father, I know many of us really desire deep friendships. But Lord, the prospect of connecting with our own brokenness and pain is a scary one. Lord, may you give us the courage to lean into our brokenness and pain and fall on our face before you as you groom us, so that we can then stand in the gap with others and ask good questions and be good listeners so that we can deepen our friendships. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.